The Western study of the Soviet economy began after World War II and really took root in the 1950s and 60s. And I think it was common ground among the economists working on the Soviet economy at that time to see Soviet economic development as primarily motivated by civilian goals, and to regard the Soviet state as a developmental state, rather like the state of Japan or South Korea a little bit later. And I think to a large extent, the scholars of that period tended to lose sight of the importance of security as a motive in Soviet economic development. I think all the people of that generation, of course, understood that the Soviet Union had thermonuclear weapons and it had a security service and so on. But nonetheless, in talking about the aims of the economy and the motivations behind capital investments and the plans for national economic development, they tended to emphasize very much civilian goals of economic growth and improving popular welfare. I think this was from a mixture of motives, and one was that I think when you're looking at a strange phenomenon, it's natural to try to understand it first by thinking, what is this like that we're familiar with? And so they tried to make the Soviet Union familiar. Another reason is that, of course, much of what went on in the Soviet economy that had military or security motivations was secret. And so Western scholars had very little access to hard information about this sort of thing. And so it, I think, became neglected. In the last 20 years, well, the Soviet state collapsed, and with it collapsed the wall of secrecy around the Soviet state. And I think that's helped scholars to begin to understand in a more balanced perspective the importance of military considerations and of security motivations. So there's one group of scholars that I think of who have worked on the importance of external security. In Russia, for example, I think of Andrei Sokolov, who's one of the people who's been involved in trying to rewrite the history of the VPK, the military-industrial complex. There's another scholar who's worked on Oleg Ken, who's written a lot about war economic mobilization. In fact, I think probably the first of these was someone that I've worked with myself in the past, Nikolai Simonov, who wrote one of the first historical accounts of the development of military industry in the Soviet economy. And if you put the work of scholars like that, and there are some Western scholars, Leonard Samuelson, David Stone, and Robert Davis, who's probably the most senior and preeminent of all of these people, you start to see two things. And one is the true scale of the Soviet military-industrial complex, which didn't encompass the whole economy, but nonetheless, it was an important part of the economy, and its influence spread through the rest of the economy through things like mobilization plans. So understanding the scale of Soviet rearmament and the military-industrial complex was one dimension. Another dimension was trying to come to a better understanding of the external context of Stalin's Veliki Perelom, the great breakthrough of the first five-year plan, and the conversion of the Soviet Bolshevik one-party state into Stalin's personal dictatorship. And if we go back to the 1920s, we can see that Stalin, first of all, he had the experience of being a political commander in the Civil War, and he had a very strong idea of the importance of food in fighting. And his experience of the Civil War taught him that you cannot have a stable war effort if the rear is unstable. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 happened in the midst of a foreign war because a significant part of Russian society became disaffected. Stalin witnessed this. He did not want it to happen again. He expected there to be foreign complications and perhaps another foreign war. And much of what he did from the mid-1920s through to 1941 in collectivizing agriculture and in building up industry and in particular the defense industries was designed to ensure that if war did come again, Russia would not be defeated and crumble and fall apart under communist rule as it had under the rule of the Romanov dynasty. So these are some of the scholars and some of the lines of work. Well, I've mentioned a lot of other people. Perhaps I should mention my own work. So I've also done a lot of work on defense industry in the 1930s and 1940s, on defense procurement, how the military budget was spent on weapons, and on the mobilization of the Soviet economy in two world wars, in the Second World War, but also in the First World War and in the Civil War. So that's my own small contribution to this subject. So if you add all this together, I think you get a much stronger impression that Soviet economic development was not primarily about building popular welfare. It was about national power, about building a stable state and ensuring that the state had the capacity to rule and project its influence abroad. So there's another scholar whose name I'm going to mention, Vladimir Kantorovich. He works in an American college. I guess he came from Russia originally. I don't know much about him, so I don't know when. And one of his contributions has been to say we ought to take seriously what the Bolsheviks said. And so it's kind of happens a lot in Western economics that you discount what the politicians say because we know that politicians make promises they don't keep. We know that politicians lie. So why bother to read what they said in the first place? Why don't we just look at the results? And what Kantorovich says is we should pay attention to what Lenin and Stalin said about their economic goals. I think if you look carefully at what they wrote about the economy, you do see some things that are clearly then expressed in the Bolshevik strategy and in the Soviet system of rule. So in terms of economics, what do we see? First of all, the belief that power comes from producing more things. Now this is not a specifically Marxist belief. I think you can find it, for example, in the writing of Friedrich List, the German economist of the 19th century. And there's not only a big tradition of economic thought that's associated with this idea, but also most people, I think, believe it. Most people who have no economic training share that belief that power comes, and indeed welfare comes, and they come together from making more things. And people have that instinctive distrust of the service economy, because the service economy produces things like knowledge and brands and information which you can't touch. So where does it go? People don't trust it, right? And so the Bolsheviks, I think, had this idea too. They wanted something you can touch, cement, steel, machinery, right? That you can lay your hands on. So that's one part of Bolshevik economics. The second thing was that the world is a jungle. The world is a struggle for domination. And this belief that they had in the importance of catching up and overtaking was quite different from the idea that the world is an arena in which we can share resources and trade with each other and trade to mutual benefit. They saw the world as an arena in which one country's gain is another country's loss. And if Russia is not to lose at other people's, to other people's profit, then Russia must gain at other people's expense. And the third thing was that power is ultimately military. And no matter what you say about soft power, about diplomacy, about competing styles or ways of life, ultimately it doesn't really count unless you have guns and missiles to back it up. And when they set goals for the economy, they very often put national defense first. Not last, not in brackets, but first. And so Kantorovich says, what we see here is something we should pay attention to. That's work that is, I think, has been done, and new approaches that have been made to the question of external security. Something that I think is also interesting is the question of internal security. So it's much harder for historians to learn about the role of the security services in economic policy or in decision making, partly because we really only have access to the archives of the security services of the 1930s. That's changing because there's now a ring of independent states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, which have taken very different political paths, and some of them have taken the path of opening up their security archives. So particularly the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine for a short period but no longer, Georgia. These are countries that are opening up their archives so that we can look at how the security services operated in the Soviet borderlands, and we can try to infer, therefore, how they operated on the scale of the whole Soviet Union. And one of the things that it's a belief. I think there is some evidence for it. I'm happy for other people to argue differently. My belief is that actually the NKVD, MGB, KGB did operate more or less the same everywhere. I don't think they had a different mode of operation for one republic compared to another. I think they had a fairly simple template for holding power, to do with surveillance and the control of organizations and the control of the way that people interacted with each other, that they implemented pretty much the same in every place where Soviet rule was extended. And so we can learn from this, and we can see that actually the KGB had quite a big role in the economy. It controlled the transmission of information. I mean, I think that goes without saying, because so much of the industrial economy was secret. There were these circles of zakrytie предприятия, the closed enterprises, enterprises with pocztowe ящики, which were designed to conceal their true location and true name. So there are concentric circles of more and less secret parts of the economy, and the KGB was intimately involved in controlling the communications into and out of these parts of the economy. It was also controlled personnel, because to hold almost any position of responsibility in the Soviet system, any position of management authority, you had to have dostup, right? Access to classified correspondence. And there were different levels of dostup, and it was the KGB that approved a person for advancement from one level to another or not. So the KGB therefore also controlled the appointment of virtually all personnel of any importance in the economy. So we can now see these things, and we can see that the KGB was intimately involved in all of these processes. I think a further question is, to what extent was the KGB involved in policy? And here I think we come to in some ways, I'm not sure if it's a surprising conclusion or not. It's a negative one. And the reason is that I think the KGB was designed around generating flows of information. And it gathered information and summarized it in reports and documents and reports of work and svodky and so on, which it channeled upwards. And this, I have this picture of a flow of paperwork that was flooding upwards onto the desk of the chairman of the KGB in Moscow. And his life was basically fairly miserable, because every day he had a huge pile of paperwork to read. And there was almost no analysis in this. You don't really see analytical reports by the KGB. It's essentially descriptions of events, of actions, of opinions. And in some ways it seems to me that the KGB's lack of analytical capability was possibly deliberate. The party wanted to have a monopoly of analysis, and any analytical conclusions would be drawn not in the KGB or in any other committee, but in the Central Committee and in the Politburo. So to summarize in a few words, one of the important changes that has been taking place in the last few years in the Western historiography of the Soviet economy has been to upgrade the importance that we give to the considerations of external and internal security. I think much more work has been done on external security. Increasingly, we're starting to have the ability to say things about the importance of internal security as well.